All right, welcome back for another deep dive. And this time, knowing our listeners, we're going right to the heart of things. We're talking about belief.
Yeah, belief. It really is kind of fundamental, isn't it, to
Yeah.
so much of what we do in philosophy.
Yeah. What does it mean to believe something? And we are, as always, taking a look at what the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the SFP, has to say about this.
It's a huge entry. I mean, it's a really, really substantial entry. So we're gonna be here a while, folks.
We are, but the goal, as always, is to give you the key takeaways, right? The things that really are going to help us to understand this topic better. And I think we should start by, just getting clear on what we're talking about here. What is belief, philosophically speaking?
Well, the way the SF puts it is that it's, taking something to be the case or regarding it as true. And I think, one important thing to remember is that you have a lot of beliefs, right? I mean, you believe that you're, capable of following this philosophical discussion. You believe that you're listening to a discussion about belief right now. You probably believe that there's some kind of reality out there that we're both interacting with. You have all these beliefs, and you don't have to be actively, affirming them all the time.
Right. They're not all at the forefront of your mind at any given moment.
Exactly.
Yeah. And also, when we talk about belief philosophically, the set points this out, we're not necessarily talking about like doubt, right? Or, extended kind of reflection. Sometimes we use belief in everyday language to talk about things that we're not sure about or that we're kind of, thinking about a lot. But that's not really what philosophers are talking about when they talk about belief.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not necessarily about uncertainty.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, philosophers often will talk about belief as, one kind of what they call propositional attitude.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an interesting idea, right?
Yeah.
We have these attitudes like belief, hope, doubt
Right.
towards, things. And the things in this case are propositions, which are, basically the meanings of sentences.
Right.
So, whether you think that, modus ponens is a valid argument or someone else thinks it in some other language, you're thinking the same thing.
Right.
You're thinking about the same proposition.
Right. So my belief that, logical consistency is good is a propositional attitude.
Right, yeah.
It's the attitude of belief towards that proposition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, the SAT even says that belief is kind of like the paradigmatic example of a propositional attitude. It's like the one that they always use when they're talking about propositional attitudes in general.
Okay. So that's kind of like what belief is. But then, how do philosophers understand what it means to have this attitude? What does it mean to believe something? And the essay lays out, like 5 or 6 different major approaches to this question.
That's right, yeah. And I think one of the biggest ones, or at least one that gets a lot of attention, is representationalism.
Representationalism.
Yeah, and that's, the name kind of gives it away.
Mental pictures.
Yeah, it's the idea that belief involves, having these internal representations of facts or propositions.
Right. Okay.
So, if you believe that, that the sky is blue, there's some kind of representation in your mind that corresponds to that fact.
Okay. So the belief itself is the representation.
In a way, yeah.
Or the representation is what it means to have the belief.
Right, yeah. And, these representations aren't just passive. They're also supposed to play a causal role in, how we behave.
Okay.
So, if you believe that something is dangerous, that's going to cause you to, avoid it or be careful around it.
Makes sense. And the SEPI talks about a couple of different, kind of versions of representationalism. One of them that sounds interesting is Fodor's language of thought hypothesis.
Right, yeah. Fodor's he was a very influential philosopher of mind. And his idea was that, we think by manipulating these sentence-like structures in our minds. So it's like a computer manipulating its code.
Right.
It has these symbols and it can combine them in different ways, and that's how it processes information.
Mm-hmm.
And Fodor thought that our brains do something similar.
Okay. So I have a belief that, all men are mortal, and that's represented as a sentence in my mind.
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea.
Yeah.
And, these sentences can be combined and manipulated to produce new thoughts.
Mm.
So, if you also believe that Socrates is a man, you can put those two sentences together and infer that Socrates is mortal.
So the manipulation of these sentences, that's the thinking.
Right. Yeah, and that's the basis of reasoning and inference and all that.
Right. Makes sense. Okay. So that's Fodor's view. And then the Isolipi also mentions Dretske, right?
Right, yeah. Dretski's, his view is a little different.
Okay.
He focuses more on these things called representational systems.
Okay.
And he gives this example of magnetosome bacteria.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure I'm familiar with those.
So these are bacteria that have little magnets inside of them.
Okay.
And they use these magnets to navigate, they move towards areas where there's less oxygen.
Okay.
And so Dretski's point is that this is a kind of representation, right? The bacteria's internal magnets represent, the direction of safety or, where they need to go.
So the direction of less oxygen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But, Dretske doesn't think that this is enough for the bacteria to have beliefs,
Okay.
because their system is too simple.
Okay.
And it hasn't been developed through learning.
Right.
So for him, having beliefs involves having a more complex system.
Okay. So I have more going on in my head than the bacteria does with its little magnets.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Makes sense. And then, a lot of representationalists also talk about the structure of these representations.
Right. Yeah.
So like if I have a belief that A or B, does that relate to my belief that A?
Exactly. Yeah.
Is there a structure there? And Fodor thought that the structure had to be kind of linguistic.
Yeah.
Like the language of thought. But other people have different ideas.
That's right. They're map-like structures,
Okay.
where, things are represented spatially.
So I guess that could be like, if I believe that, philosophy is important and I believe that logic is important, those beliefs might be like closer together in my mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then if I also believe that, quantum physics is important, that might be further away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And then there are also connectionist models,
Mm.
which are more, kind of based on neural networks.
Right.
And that gets pretty complicated.
Yeah. All right. So that's representationalism. What about dispositionalism?
Right. So dispositionalism, it's another major approach, and it's really all about behavior. The basic idea is that to believe something is to be disposed to act in a certain way.
Okay, so if I believe that, let's say, a particular argument is sound, then I'm disposed to, I don't know, use that argument or accept its conclusion or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you believe that, that fire's hot, you're going to be disposed to avoid putting your hand in the fire.
Right, makes sense.
So it's all about these dispositions to behave in certain ways.
Okay. And this view has been around for a while, right?
It has, yeah.
But it also has some problems.
It does, yeah.
The Sapir lays out a couple of them.
One of the big ones is that, you can have the same belief and act in very different ways depending on the circumstances.
Right.
So, you might believe that that you should be kind to animals, but, if you're starving, you might eat a hamburger.
Right.
And so the dispositionalist has to explain how you can have the same belief and act in such different ways.
So it's not just about any given action. It's about, like, a pattern of behavior.
That's right. Yeah. It's about your overall disposition.
Okay. And I think the other problem that I was thinking of is that, what about people who, like, can't act on their beliefs or who, choose not to for whatever reason?
Right. Yeah.
Do they not have those beliefs?
Yeah, that's another tough one for the dispositionalist.
Right.
Like someone who's paralyzed might believe that they can walk even though they can't actually walk.
Right? Yeah. Or someone might have a secret belief that they're ashamed of, and so they would never act on it.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a real challenge for the dispositionalist.
Okay, so is dispositionalism kind of a dead end then?
Not necessarily. I mean, there are philosophers who are still working on it and trying to come up with more sophisticated versions. The SEP mentions liberal dispositionalism, which tries to address these problems.
Liberal dispositionalism?
Yeah, it's a little more flexible. It doesn't require that your beliefs manifest in, outward behavior all the time.
Okay. So it's not just about the stuff that you actually do?
Right, yeah.
It could also be about, like, your inner states or something.
Think of it like your thoughts, your feelings,
Yeah.
your inclinations. All of that could be relevant.
Okay. So maybe there's still some life in dispositionalism.
Maybe, yeah. But it's definitely a view that, has some challenges.
Okay. All right. So what's next? We've got representationalism, dispositionalism. What other big views are out there? Well, the next one that the SEPI talks about is interpretationism.
Interpretationism.
Yeah. And this view is really interesting because it brings in this idea of how we interpret each other's behavior.
Okay.
So the basic idea is that we attribute beliefs to people based on how well those beliefs allow us to understand their actions.
Okay.
We see someone doing something and we say, well, they must believe X because that would explain why they're doing that.
Okay, so like if I see you reading the SEPA, I might think, he must believe that the SEP is a good source of information about philosophy.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great example.
Okay. And the SEP mentions a couple of really big names associated with this view, Dennett and Davidson.
Yeah, they're two of the most influential philosophers of mind in recent times.
Okay.
And they have slightly different takes on this, but the basic idea is the same.
Okay. And Dennett has this kind of framework for talking about how we interpret behavior.
He does, yeah.
He calls it the intentional stance.
Right, yeah. And it's kind of a way of looking at, at systems and trying to understand how they work.
Okay.
So, we can look at a system from a physical stance where we're just looking at its physical properties.
Okay.
Or we can look at it from a design stance where we're looking at its function.
Okay.
But when it comes to, to people and other intelligent beings, the intentional stance is often the most useful.
Okay, so the intentional stance is, the way of looking at things that takes into account their beliefs and desires.
Exactly, yeah.
And assumes they're acting rationally based on those beliefs and desires.
Right. So, if we see someone, carefully checking their sources before they write a paper, we might say, well, they must believe that it's important to be accurate and they must desire to, to avoid making mistakes.
Right.
And that would explain why they're behaving the way they are.
Okay. And Dennett even uses this to talk about the possibility of artificial intelligence having beliefs, right?
It does, yeah.
Like his chess-playing computer.
Right. If we have a computer that can play chess really well and we can predict its moves by attributing beliefs and desires to it, then maybe it does have beliefs and desires.
Right, even though we don't necessarily know how it's doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then Davidson, I think he kind of ties this into language, right?
He does, yeah.
Interpretation of language.
So his idea is that, when we're trying to understand someone who speaks a different language,
right,
we have to, figure out what their words mean, but we also have to figure out what they believe and what they want.
Right.
And we have to do all of that at the same time.
Right.
So it's a kind of holistic process.
Okay. So the attribution of beliefs is part of how we make sense of their language.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. And one interesting thing that the ASI points out is that both Dennett and Davidson kind of agree that belief attribution is, what do they call it, indeterminate?
Yeah, indeterminate.
So what does that mean?
It means that, there might be different ways of attributing beliefs to someone that are all equally good.
Okay.
So there might not be one right answer.
Right. So, I might be able to explain your behavior in terms of one set of beliefs, and somebody else might be able to explain it in terms of a different set of beliefs.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. But they could both be good explanations.
Yeah, and there might not be any way to say for sure which one is right.
Okay. So that's kind of trippy.
It is, yeah. It's a little bit unsettling.
Yeah. All right. So we've got representationalism, dispositionalism, interpretationism. What else is out there?
Well, there's also functionalism.
Functionalism.
Yeah. And, this is a really important view in the philosophy of mind.
Okay.
And the basic idea is that we can define mental states, like beliefs, in terms of their causal roles.
Okay.
So it's not about what beliefs are made of.
Yeah.
It's not about whether they're representations or dispositions or whatever.
Yeah.
It's about what they do.
Right.
What are their inputs and their outputs? What causes them and what effects do they have?
Okay. So if I believe that, the SEPI is a good resource, that belief is going to be caused by, I don't know, my past experiences with the SEP, my, hearing other people talk about the SEP.
Right, yeah.
And it's going to have effects like, I'm going to keep reading the SEP. I'm going to tell other people about the SEP.
That's right, yeah. That's exactly it.
Okay. And this view can kind of be combined with other views, right?
It can, yeah.
You can be a functionalist and a representationalist, or a functionalist and an interpretationist.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. And, there's this analogy that I always find helpful, which is thinking about a hard drive.
Okay.
A hard drive is defined by its function.
Right.
It's defined by what it does. It stores information. It retrieves information. And it doesn't matter what it's made of.
Right, yeah.
It could be made of silicon. It could be made of,
Yeah.
I don't know, magic fairy dust. As long as it does those things, it's a hard drive.
Exactly, yeah.
And so it's kind of the same with belief, right?
Right. Belief is something that plays a certain causal role in our mental lives.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what it's made of. It could be a representation, it could be a disposition, it could be something else entirely.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. And now I think we're getting into some of the more, shall we say, controversial
Yeah,
ones?
the more skeptical views about belief.
Right, yeah. So what about eliminativism?
Right. So eliminativism is the view that beliefs don't exist.
They just don't exist.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, at all.
At all. The eliminativist would say that, the concept of belief is just part of this folk psychology that we use to explain each other's behavior,
Okay.
but it's not a scientifically accurate concept.
Okay.
And as our understanding of the brain improves, we're just going to abandon the concept of belief altogether.
Okay. So it's kind of like, I don't know, phlogiston or something like that.
Right, yeah. It's like an outdated scientific concept
Okay.
that we're just going to throw away once we have a better understanding of what's really going on.
Okay. So that's eliminativism. And then there's instrumentalism.
Right. So instrumentalism is a bit more moderate.
Okay.
It's the view that the belief attributions are useful.
Okay.
They're a good way of predicting and explaining behavior,
Right.
but they're not necessarily true.
Okay.
Or at least they're not true in the same way that, scientific statements are true.
Okay. So we might say this person believes X, and that might be a useful thing to say,
Right.
but we're not actually saying that there's this thing in their head called a belief that corresponds to X.
That's right. Yeah. It's more like we're using the concept of belief as a tool,
Okay.
to help us understand the world.
And then there's this view called fictionalism,
Right. Yeah.
which I guess is kind of similar to instrumentalism, but maybe even more, I don't know, radical.
Yeah, maybe a little bit.
Or at least it kind of leans into the idea that beliefs are, kind of made up.
Yeah, that they're fictions.
Right, yeah.
And that we use these fictions to make sense of the world, but we shouldn't take them too literally.
Okay. And then there's normativism.
Right. So normativism is a little bit different from the other views we've been talking about.
Okay.
It's not so much about, what beliefs are or whether they exist.
Okay.
It's more about how we should think about beliefs.
Okay.
So the basic idea is that beliefs have a kind of normative dimension.
Okay.
They're not just, things that happen in our heads.
Right.
They're also things that can be right or wrong.
Okay.
There are standards for what we should believe.
Okay. So if I believe something that's false, then I'm doing something wrong.
Right.
I have a bad belief.
That's the idea. Yeah.
Okay.
And, there are different ways of spelling out this normative dimension, but that's the basic idea.
Okay. So those are the big views on the nature of belief itself. And then the SEP moves on to talk about, different kinds of belief.
Right. Yeah. Different types of beliefs.
So what are some of the distinctions they make there?
Well, one of the big ones is between occurrent and dispositional belief.
Occurrent and dispositional.
Yeah. And, this is actually kind of a general distinction in philosophy.
Okay.
We can talk about, events that are occurring, like, right now I'm talking.
Right.
And we can talk about dispositions, which are, tendencies to do things under certain circumstances.
Right. Like I am disposed to use a lot of ums and ahs when I talk.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, occurrent beliefs are the beliefs that you're actually thinking about right now.
Okay.
The ones that are in the forefront of your mind.
Okay.
And dispositional beliefs are the beliefs that you have, even when you're not thinking about them.
Okay. So right now I'm thinking about, this distinction between occurrent and dispositional belief. Right.
But, 5 minutes ago, I wasn't thinking about that.
Yeah.
But I still have the belief that, the earth is round or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So that would be a dispositional belief.
Okay. Makes sense. And then they also talk about implicit belief, right?
Right. Yeah.
Which is a kind of tricky one.
It is. Yeah.
Because, it's not always clear what it means to have a belief that you're not aware of.
Right. Yeah.
But, the SEP gives a couple of examples. One of them is the belief that, if A implies B and A is true, then B is true.
Right.
So that's kind of a rule of logic, right?
Yeah. It's called modus ponens.
Right. Modus ponens. And, we all believe that, presumably.
Right.
But we don't necessarily have to think about it every time we use it.
Yeah. It's not like we have a separate mental representation for every possible instance of modus ponens.
Right. Yeah. So in a sense, we have this implicit belief that, modus ponens is valid.
Exactly, yeah. And then the other kind of implicit belief that they talk about is belief without conscious endorsement.
Right. So this is more about, beliefs that we might have that conflict with our conscious values.
Okay.
Like maybe you consciously believe that all people are equal,
Okay.
but you also have this implicit bias against, people of a certain race or gender.
Right.
And that bias might manifest itself in your behavior, even though you're not consciously aware of it.
Right. Okay. And then there's this discussion of degrees of belief.
Right, yeah.
Which is, the idea that we don't always believe things with like 100% certainty.
That's right.
We might be more or less certain about different things.
Yeah, exactly. And philosophers often use this term credence to talk about degrees of belief.
Okay.
So, you might have a high credence that the sun will rise tomorrow, but a low credence that you'll win the lottery.
Right, yeah.
And this connects to, to decision theory because, how much you're willing to bet on something depends on your credence in it.
Right.
If you have a really low credence that something's going to happen, you're not going to bet very much money on it.
Right, yeah.
And the SEP also talks about this distinction between belief and acceptance.
Okay. And those seem pretty closely related, but I guess there's a difference.
There is, yeah.
There is. Okay.
So acceptance is more about, it's more voluntary.
Okay.
It's more like a decision. So, you might accept that a certain theory is true for the purposes of, doing some research.
Right.
But you might not actually believe that it's true.
Oh, okay.
You're just accepting it as a working hypothesis.
Right.
Or, you might believe that something is dangerous, but you might not accept that you need to do anything about it.
Right. Okay.
Like you might believe that climate change is real,
Yeah.
but you might not accept that you need to, change your lifestyle to do anything about it.
Right.
So belief and acceptance can come apart.
Okay. And then, of course, there's the big one, belief and knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
Which, that's a whole other deep dive.
That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah. But, just briefly, what's the connection there?
Well, the traditional view of knowledge is that it's justified true belief.
Right.
So in order to know something, you have to believe it, you have to have good reasons for believing it, and it has to be true.
Right.
But, that view has been challenged a lot in recent years.
Right, yeah.
And there are all sorts of other accounts of knowledge out there now.
Okay.
But that's the traditional view.
Right. And then finally, they talk about belief and delusion.
Right, yeah.
Which is a really interesting one, I think.
It is, yeah.
Because, in a sense, a delusion is a belief, right?
Yeah, it's a false belief.
Right.
But it's also more than that.
Okay.
Delusions are often very resistant to evidence.
Okay.
And they can be very harmful.
Right.
They can lead people to do things that are dangerous to themselves or others.
Right.
So it's an important distinction to make.
Okay. So that's a good overview of the different kinds of belief. And then the ASEP goes on to talk about the content of beliefs.
That's right.
What are our beliefs about?
Yeah. And one of the big questions here is whether belief content is fine-grained or coarse-grained.
Fine-grained or coarse-grained?
Yeah. And this has to do with the metaphysics of propositions.
Okay. And I remember propositions, those are the meanings of sentences, right?
That's right, yeah. So, if I say the cat is on the mat, that sentence expresses a proposition.
Okay.
And that proposition is either true or false.
Right.
Now, the question is, how fine-grained are propositions?
Okay. Expert speaker?